Welcome to Going Antiviral, the podcast for the IAS-USA, a professional continuing medical education organization focused on HIV and other viral diseases. I'm Dr. Michael Saag, professor of medicine and infectious diseases at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and volunteer member of the IAS-USA Board of Directors. Today, September 16, 2025, we are speaking with Dr Averitt, a social justice advocate and founder of organizations focused on women living with HIV and AIDS, such as the Well Project and the Women's Information Service and Exchange. Ms. Averitt has served on several scientific and advisory committees, including 2 terms on the President's Advisory Council on HIV and AIDS, or PACHA, and has been responsible for key achievements in guiding FDA labeling decisions and shaping research and policy priorities at the NIH. Today, she joins us to discuss HIV advocacy and the importance of scientific research. Dawn, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's great to have you. We've got a lot to go over. So let's just start with you. How did this kind of strange trip that you started back soon after you graduated college? Take us through a brief background of what happened.
Yeah. This is the journey no one really signs up for, and it wasn't even after I finished college. I was diagnosed with HIV in 1988 when I was 19. So I was still in college, and there was that moment when I was first diagnosed where, in 1988, the doctor who diagnosed me had never diagnosed another woman, and the goal was 6 months. And so it was hard to imagine even going back to college in those days. So it's been a long journey. I had the 37th anniversary of my HIV diagnosis this summer. So it feels sort of extraordinary.
Wow, that's almost twice as long as you've been alive almost. It's kind of something like that. It's wild. Well, it's good to have you here still. And,
Thanks.
and we started working together. You were in Atlanta, we'll come back to this, worked with one of the buyers clubs there and Tom Blunt and a lot of folks. But you started coming back and forth to Birmingham for assessments for clinical trials and access to different therapies. But let's go back to Atlanta in the late 80s. You're looking for treatments. AZT had just been approved. Talk us through your treatment experience and how that led to advocacy for you.
Yeah, those were terrifying days. I mean, there was people were dying all around me, and in the very first moment after I was diagnosed, the doctor who diagnosed me said, let's do 1 month of this new drug called AZT and see what it does for you. I don't even know if this is really going to work, but you shouldn't put it on your family's insurance because your parents will lose their insurance potentially, and it's really expensive. Can you guys find a way to pay for the $1,200 or whatever it was for the month out of pocket? And fortunately, I had the what I now know is the incredible privilege of actually having my parents know, because they were with me when I was diagnosed. That is not something that most people can say. And so, they took out a loan and got me a month's worth of AZT. And of course, we knew so little about AZT. Even in those days, we did it all wrong. It was 1,200 milligrams, 2 every 4 hours, 24 hours a day. I remember when the protease inhibitors came around 6, 7, 8 years later, and people started talking about what was compliance and evolved to adherence. It was like it was a new thing. And I thought, no, it's not a new thing. If you did early days of AZT, you set your alarm for midnight and 4 a.m. and 8 a.m. because you took it around the clock. Of course, we now know so much more, but and it made me horrifically sick. And I at that moment kind of said, I hope I never have to take these medicines again, as long as I keep my, immune system in good shape. So that was my first exposure to antiretroviral therapy, and it was the only option. And my whole goal after that 1 month was stay well enough to not have to take these horrible meds.
Just with diet, exercise, doing all the right things that you could. How did you get involved with the Buyers Club and with the support groups out of Atlanta?
So I didn't get involved with them right away. I didn't know another person living with HIV when I was diagnosed, and I was a bit of an anomaly for the doctor who diagnosed me. So I made a decision to go back to college, and I got my degree. They told me, interestingly, I was in school in New York City at NYU, and they said, I don't think you can handle those harsh winters. And so I transferred into Emory and then Georgia State, where my family was, to be at home um, and get through getting my college degree. So really, I got my college degree and I got my first job in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill, working for a high profile U.S. Senator, Sam Nunn, in his
No.
mailroom. Yeah, those were those early days. And worked my way into like a press assistant position, and and found myself in the enviable role of the Saturday duty at the office when ACT UP and Queer Nation showed up at the office with fake vials of blood because they believed that Sam Nunn was against gays in the military because of AIDS.
Mm.
And no one knew my HIV status at that point. So they showed up in our office shaking these fake vials of blood and saying, "You're a bigot, you hate people with AIDS." And I was like, no, 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 no. I don't hate you. I'm not afraid of you. But I couldn't tell them that I had HIV. And no one in the office knew I had HIV. It was like what the two pieces of advice I was given when I was diagnosed is don't read anything. It's too confusing. And don't tell anyone because it will ruin your family's life. So that's what the early, like the early days of this and, the late 80s were terrifying. It was like the burden was trying to stay healthy and well, and also making sure that no one knew, because if they knew, it was going to ruin everything.
And you were probably cringing and said, "Just don't you know who I
Yeah,
am? Don't you
I,
know I'm going through this?" Wow.
and I couldn't tell them, I couldn't tell them. But that was the moment when I realized that there was this whole like world and network of advocates and activists who were out there trying to kind of change decision makers' minds. These were the late 80s and early 90s, and it was a terrifying time to have HIV. So it wasn't until that in 1991, actually 1992, when that happened, and I decided to come back to Atlanta and find a job. And I got my very first job at the AIDS Survival Project in Atlanta, Georgia, as the treatment resource specialist, which is how I found you at UAB.
Mm. And what was the mission and the purpose of the AIDS Survival Project?
The AIDS Survival Project was originally the Atlanta chapter of the National Association of People with AIDS. So it was the Atlanta organization and had just made a decision to become this new entity, the AIDS Survival Project. And frankly, it was just a grassroots AIDS service organization. So peer counseling, treatment information to the best of their ability, all kinds of programs. The early days, there was an Operation Survive program, like how do you survive this till the next treatment comes along? And, you know, relatively speaking, it was a 96% gay white male organization in Midtown Atlanta. And I'll never forget going in for my job interview for the position of treatment resource specialist, because I was coming from Washington, D.C. I went in my pumps and my pantyhose, and I had spent all night memorizing the Project Inform OI chart. And I sat down in front of this, as I fondly described them, the beleaguered set of queens, one of whom was Tom Blunt, who were all kind of sitting there in t-shirts and jeans looking at me kind of like, how did you end up here? Did you get sentenced to community service, or, like, what's your story? And I had to, for the first time, tell a group of people I didn't know, no, I have HIV. And it was my first, like, here's a group of people that are not my family and not anyone I know, and I'm going to just put it out there. And you know, they very sweetly say they either thought I was a pathological liar or a gold mine. I hope it worked out to be a gold mine.
Wow, I don't think I'd heard that story before. That's amazing. So and you felt at the time kind of relieved in a way, right? You as people you could be upfront and honest with, um, and then you started working there, and you're part of what I remember the AIDS Survival Project did was try to help people gain access to therapies, some of which were not on the market yet, right? Or some of which were still in development. Tell us a little bit about that activity.
So the AIDS Survival Project and the Atlanta Buyers Club were bedfellows, like they were adjacent organizations, separate but adjacent. And the community was really super tight in Atlanta, and we were desperate. We were, looking for anything. I mean, these were the days of megadosing vitamin C and doing mistletoe extract imported from Germany, and doing every kind of what we then referred to them as alternative therapies there could possibly be, because this is early 90s. So there's AZT has been approved, DDI has been approved, DDC has been approved. A D4T is actually only available on parallel track at this point. So these are just the early days, just the nukes. And, people are dying. People are, our friends are dying, and people are dying all around us. So um, everybody was scrappy, and everybody was doing the best they could. And there were these, wonderful, I don't know how else to describe them other than benefactors. And they were largely, gay men who had resources, who were working with scientists kind of off the center screen to try to recreate drugs that were in clinical trials, to get them to us faster. And we were fighting with the FDA about accelerated approval. And, there was everything was going in, everything we had was going into compassionate access, and ways in which people who are really have no other choices, could get access to medication. So those early days were really, they were terrifying, and they were rugged. And I took this job as a treatment resource specialist. And, to level set people on this was 1993 when I started with the AIDS Survival Project. And this is still 5 years before Google. So I wasn't Googling anything. I was reading, I had a stack of journals and newsletters stacked, next to my desk, waist high. And I was frantically reading everything and making photocopies and putting 3-hole punch in, and creating a resource library that was a physical place full of blue, 1-inch binders of articles about everything from nutrition and stress management, but new treatments and what we understood about the immune system, et cetera, et cetera. This is before we had access to viral load testing. It really was kind of the dark ages in the early days.
It really was. And just a quick aside, a lot of people have come up to me after this movie was released with Matthew McConaughey, called Dallas Buyers Club. It was nothing like that. There wasn't profiteering. It was true volunteerism and a lot of generosity from a lot of people pulling together. And that was what most buyers clubs were, most aid service organizations were at the time. And I thought the movie was important in terms of telling people how bad things were back in that time, but it was nowhere reflective of what the reality was for most buyers clubs. It was a little not. It was more than a little misleading.
It was, those days, there were things about that movie that were super resonant for me, that the desperation, the scrappiness, all of the things that we were just kind of talking about was really real. And I thought they did a good job portraying some of that. I think that, maybe somewhere peripherally on the edge, there were some people who were trying to get away with something, but the vast majority of it
Unbelievable. Yeah.
was just people leaning in with everything they had. They were, and those were the early days of selling your life insurance policy and, mortgaging everything you had. Because if you were only going to be alive for 6 more months, what the hell, right? And it's hard. I mean, the AIDS service world became home for most of us. Like we became like our organizations were our families, and were our treaters, and were our therapists, and were our, like they were our support networks. I was a bit of an anomaly because I had supportive parents, and so many people. We lost so many people whose families never even knew. They just couldn't even tell. The shame associated with an HIV diagnosis was so great, and the stigma. And, we still have stigma today. It looks different. It's in some ways, there are things about it that are almost worse, because in an environment where you think that everyone should be maybe okay, it's not. It's still not okay. But yeah.
So, I mean, I was also flashed to the AIDS treatment news, that newsletter that I thought was fabulous. John, I forgot his last name, published it once a month, and I got a lot.
James.
Yeah, John James, wonderful guy. Um,
Yes.
all right, so it's obvious then, at least to anybody paying attention to the story to this point, where your passion came from, especially for helping women who were diagnosed with HIV, because you were, as you said, an anomaly up front. You knew what it was like to be a little bit isolated.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a team, it was a family sort of community, but you were different, and you formed the Well Project and other things that have done so many great things to support women. And that type of activism is just a plus plus, because it hits a need. It's meant to put the person with HIV first in the front seat, and you're there to support them. Let's segue a little bit to more current times.
Yeah.
Um, of where, let's start with HIV activism today. Where is that, and what kind of missions are quote unquote activists of today's HIV world? What are they doing?
Well, it's a big question and a much longer podcast than we probably have time for. But the reality is, for those of us who were around in the 80s and the 90s, the protease inhibitors became available in the mid 90s. In 1995, December 95 was the Roche drug, and then 96 was the other two initial protease inhibitors, and that was a big kind of milestone in this fight, a big change. But over the years, advocacy has evolved as the movement has evolved. It. I think that many of us from the early days were surprised. Maybe surprise isn't the right term, but the reality of us getting the drugs developed um, didn't become the challenge. The challenge became access and getting the drugs in the hands of the people who needed them. And I don't know, I feel a little like for many years, especially for those of us who were really focused on treatment advocacy, that there was a bit of a baton, race, and we like did all of the, all three runners went, and then you went to hand off like, now we have a drug and it's approved, and there was no runner there because we hadn't really worked on this whole access piece. So over the years, obviously, it has evolved significantly. And over the last couple of years, maybe because I'm getting to be an old curmudgeon and crotchety about this, I felt like there's been a lot more. Well, I mean, it's the advocacy realm is so much more robust. It's not just about treatment, it's about prevention, it's about diagnostics, it's about the development of cure. It was so narrowly focused in the early days. So comparing the early days of advocacy to today is maybe a little disingenuous because it's not the same animal. And there's so much sophistication now. We have technology, we have, we have so much more. Ironically, the last 6 months or so have made me think a lot about the early days, because we're seeing things get rolled back in ways that I don't think any of us ever could have imagined. And, it's a scary time. It's entirely different for people to not have access to treatment and care, um, when we know how to do it and what we need to do it with, versus the early days when people didn't have access to treatment and care, but there was nothing to treat them with, and nobody knew how or what they were dealing with. So there's the insidious nature of where we are in this moment is I think is a real reckoning around how we do advocacy effectively in an environment where we're being undermined in lots of ways.
Yeah, I think you framed that really well. So, back in the older days, in the early 90s, it was finding treatments that could actually work and not make people gravely sick, just
Right.
taking the medicine. Then the newer drugs come along, they suppress viral load, but then access to the drugs, getting them paid for, and that effort was joined in a mighty way by the Ryan White Care Act, which ended up covering those drugs for someone like yourself in 1989. Instead of your parents taking out a $1,200 a month loan, they could get access to the medicine based on need that the government program took care of. And all of a sudden, for anyone who was in care, they could get their medicines. And then there's another group of people with HIV who either A, didn't know their diagnosis, or if they did, they were having trouble managing getting to care, staying in care. And a lot of the advocacy turned towards these uh, populations that are more, I don't know a word exactly, marginalized or on
Yeah.
the outside looking in, reaching out to them. And that really gained a lot of momentum in between 2010 and 2020. And now a lot of those populations are going underground again
Yeah.
because of fear, and either they're going to be deported perhaps, or their fear of being deported, even if they're U.S. citizens in some ways, and also in the transgender community and the gay community to a degree are feeling under siege
Yeah.
with a lot of the policies right now. So would you say a lot of the advocacy is now focused on those populations and what's being done?
I mean, I don't know many people living with HIV or um, vulnerable to HIV who don't feel a little bit under siege at this point, or a lot under siege. And it's about access to treatment or prevention for sure, but it's about so much more. The support programs, the social support network is being dismantled in a lot of ways, and the things that help stabilize people in their lives so that they can actually effectively use treatment, so that they can effectively use prevention modalities to keep themselves healthy and well. A lot of the things that all of this is built upon, a lot of those things are going away, or they're in jeopardy, or there's fear around accessing them. So I think that the advocacy in some ways is about stabilizing people and communities. It's about figuring out how we keep people safe. I mean, we're starting from ground zero here right now. Now, a lot of the advocacy is really truly about keeping people safe. In July, I went and did a congressional briefing, and the whole premise of it was to make a case for why we should continue to do medical research, not HIV research, but just medical research. And, when you're starting from that point, you were talking about, people feeling at risk, persecuted, and vulnerable for who they are, where they live, what they look like. I mean, just everything. So I think, I don't think anyone, my humble opinion here is, no one in this country should be sitting on the sidelines or in the bleachers. Like, we all have to be advocates for our families, our friends, our communities, and for people we don't know.
Yeah, I think the science coming under siege is something that I don't think any of us saw coming. Um, Everything you said about the HIV specific community is real, and that's a project in and of itself, just trying to provide support. But this notion you're going to Capitol Hill just to talk in June or July, just to talk about science is totally unexpected. And all of us are in that battle right now, just trying to keep the focus on the prize of continuing biomedical research in the country that's unencumbered by politics. And so our time, sadly, is running by very quickly. I'd like to maybe have you finish with a thought or commentary about what can we do based on your experience with advocacy going back to the early 90s when we want to make a stand. You said people shouldn't be on the sidelines right now, they should be in the game. Give us your best advice about what you think will work in terms of raising awareness, getting rid of mistrust, and helping the public understand the benefits of science.
Well, if only I had the answer about what would work. But here's what I believe: I believe we all make a difference. And collectively, the difference is the thing we're after. Everybody leaning in for whatever they can do. I think part of what's happening right now is so demoralizing and kind of big and pervasive in a way that I don't think any of us could have really imagined, that it's hard to know what to do. And, you know, the things we did in the early days, we didn't know what was going to work. It was scattershot. We were throwing everything we could at it. And we kind of have to go back to that. And I feel like I've used the word already twice in this conversation, scrappy, but that's what I think of. I think of in this moment, we don't have to have the answer. What we have to do is take action, any action, show up in the ways that you can show up. And, hopefully it will become clear the things that are helping us move the bar. And then, but these are truly the days where we can't say, well, I'm just one person, I'm just one voice. These are the days when we all have to lean in, because it will impact every one of us, whether you have HIV or some other underlying medical condition today or down the road. I think the reality is we all have to show up in whatever way we can every day.
That's a great message. It is so overwhelming at times and demoralizing, as you said, that we sort of want to retreat, turn off the news, stop reading online articles or newspapers just because it's so chilling. But maybe the opposite is really what's required right now. And yet, talking to others, especially people who may not believe fully in what to speak in our own little echo chambers is maybe good for our psychology, but and our state of mind. But really, to make a difference, we have to be able to reach out to others and have a calm, respectful conversation. And then, as you said, get involved in other ways, be active. And that's what we all need to do. Dawn, you have been great, as I knew you would be. It is so much fun to have been able to work with you over the years. We're pushing well over 30 years together at this point. Not sure we have 30 more in us, but whatever we do, let's keep doing it together. And thank you so much for being on the podcast today with me.
Mike, it's always a pleasure. You have been an incredible, true hero in this work. So I'm grateful to get the time with you anytime.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Going Antiviral. Catch up on earlier episodes wherever you listen to podcasts, And check out the video versions of this episode and others on the IAS-USA YouTube channel. You can find these links in the show notes, or simply go to YouTube and search for IAS-USA, and there they are. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review Going Antiviral on Apple Podcasts. This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to serve as medical advice. Opinions expressed on this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the IAS-USA and its affiliates. And the viewpoints of the individuals on this podcast do not necessarily represent the viewpoints of their institutions. If you have a question you'd like answered on the show, you can send it to podcast@iasusa.org to be answered in a future episode. Thanks for listening.